We just listened to the first 2 episodes of a new podcast, and we want to tell you all about it.
The show is called Nobody Should Believe Me, and it's a groundbreaking investigation into Munchausen by proxy. Anyone who listens to Murdersheet knows we really appreciate a deep dive into a subject. Well, no one has ever done anything of this depth and breadth on the topic before. You will be enthralled by the stories it tells, but even more importantly, you will learn a great deal about how to keep kids in your community safe from harm.
But what makes this show different is that the host of the podcast, novelist Andrea Dunlop, has a uniquely personal connection to this subject. Someone close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy a while ago. So to her, this is not just something that happens to other people. Her personal story really gives this show an emotional punch.
It also means she really makes an effort to get at the humanity of all of the people involved, all the victims and survivors. This isn't a podcast that focuses on the gruesome details. It has heart. Andrea really uses her storytelling skills to help us get to know the wide variety of people whose lives have been affected by Munchausen by proxy.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder. If you haven't done so already, please go back and listen to our last 4 episodes to catch up on our look at the 2017 murders at the Nadia Fish and Chicken in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago. This will be our 5th and final episode of In the Shadow of Nadia.
As a recap, on the night before the killings at the restaurant, a man named Jerry Jacobs was gunned down in the South Shore. The next afternoon, a gunman killed 4 young men at the Nadia restaurant. Hours later, someone murdered a couple in their car in an area not far from the earlier murders. The police quickly arrested Jerry Jacobs' 19-year-old son, Maurice Harris, claiming that he had killed the 4 men at the restaurant in retaliation for the death of his father. And then they went to the media, outlining their seemingly strong case against Maurice for the murders. Overnight, it seemed as if all of Chicago was convinced of his guilt. His family and friends remained in his corner, though. So did Ian Barney, the attorney who represented Maurice in his civil suit against the Chicago Police Department. The justice system moved slowly. Over 3 years passed. Maurice remained incarcerated. The city moved on. Most people forgot about him. And then there was a surprise.
Murder charges against the man accused of shooting 4 people inside a Chicago restaurant back in 2017 are now dropped. 22-year-old Maurice Harris was facing more than 24 counts. One of his attorneys tells the Chicago Sun-Times he expects Harris to be released from jail, quote, relatively soon. Katie Johnston for CBS 2 Chicago.
My name is Áine Cain.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murdersheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Áine and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murdersheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage. We're the Murdersheet, and this is In the Shadow of Nadia, The Reckoning.
asked Maurice's attorney, Ian Barney, about how this case finally ended.
Can you discuss with us the process of what was involved in getting the charges dismissed?
Well, I mean, the process was basically presenting everything we had to the state's attorney who was handling the case, who is a very good guy, very smart prosecutor, but he is somebody who I think that I trusted that he wanted to also get it right. So that was encouraging, and we kind of, wanted to marshal our evidence for him, and we talked to him about it multiple times. And then, he had his own stuff going on in terms of the information that they had received from the U.S. Attorney's Office and some of the other information in the case. So the process was basically, we just kept at it with him, kept the kind of conversation going. And he promised to have an open mind on the case, and so far as accepting new information and not being totally myopic. And he did that. He I think when he came on the case, he believed that, they had the right guy, but over time, I think that, I guess the way I would put it is the calculation changed in terms of he no longer believed he could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Maurice Harris committed the crime.
I think ultimately, I said this before, ultimately what really convinced them was this information from the U.S. Attorney's Office. But I think that, it's unusual for a quadruple homicide to get dismissed. I think that's a mild way of putting it. I'm not sure that they would have dismissed it without having additional evidence that corroborated the information that they had received. I think that in defense investigation, we did a good job of bringing all that stuff forward and kind of giving the prosecutor a sound basis to not move forward with the case.
For Maurice and his family, it was the happy ending they had hoped for since the day he was arrested. But this young man had spent years of his life behind bars for a crime he did not commit. Why did it take so long for the authorities to recognize they had made a mistake?
It's not unusual, I would say, for murder cases to take time to work their way towards trial. It's not unusual in general. In this particular case, I would say there were a number of factors that prolonged the process even more. Yeah, but the justice system works slow. There's a lot to do, and from our perspective, one thing we kept preaching was patience because we wanted to get it right. We felt like we could get this right. We felt like we had really put the case on a good track with our investigation. The case pended for a while, but for reasons that when you're in the process make sense. It's not as if there was feet dragging going on by anybody.
I wanted to ask you if there were any moments while looking into this case where you kind of were like, I don't know if we're going to be able to solve this or help Maurice and prove that he's innocent and get him out of jail at this point. Like, did you have like any specific moments where you were very concerned in that regard?
The whole case, to be honest with you, up until the point they dismissed it, because my feeling is that it would have been a jury trial. You go to a jury trial and the outcome is just uncertain. I think I said this last time. People are convicted for things that they didn't do. That is a fact. We know that happens. And jurors do the best they can. But one, this was an emotionally charged case. It was really a cold-blooded case. These were cold-blooded murders. One of the individuals was essentially executed on the sidewalk. It's not the type of case that you really want to be defending somebody against in front of a jury. It was a really horrible case. So from that perspective, we were always worried about it. I never wanted it to go to trial. I felt confident that we would do a great job for Maurice. I knew that. We had worked our tail off on the investigation. We had gathered a whole bunch of evidence that was exculpatory or put holes in the state's case or whatever the case was. But at the end of the day, you just don't know what a jury's going to do. You don't know what what they're going to consider. You don't know what they're going to believe. You don't know what they're going to think is the most important thing in the case. So while I may, as a lawyer, may think X is important, a jury may think Y is important. So it was always a fear that even though we were doing everything under the sun to win the case for Maurice, that it wouldn't have been enough. That you go to a jury trial and there's a degree of luck involved.
One reason why juries can be so unpredictable is that they get their information from the press. At times, the media can be structurally biased towards police and law enforcement. For instance, the news of Maurice's arrest back in 2017 generated prominent media coverage throughout not just Chicago, but all over the country. But when the charges against him were dropped, it was a much smaller story. In Barney's experience, this sort of thing is not unusual.
I mean, my experience is the media, and I'm certainly a fan of the press just in general, but the media jumps all over cases when they're first charged, and they put in the kind of salacious details that the prosecutors or the police release at the beginning, and then they don't ever show up to court again, and they don't know anything about the case, and they don't know what happened to the case, and there's people who are acquitted of crimes that they were, convicted of in the press at the beginning of the case, and the record's not corrected. And I was disappointed to see that there wasn't a better correction here, just in general, from some of the reporters who wrote stories when Maurice was arrested, and, recited all of the information provided by the Chicago Police Department in their press conference and by the state's attorney's office and their bond hearing proffer and all that kind of stuff. That was printed, but I don't know if anybody was at that court date when the case was dismissed and the state's attorney said we don't have the evidence to move forward to prove the case. So that's disappointing for sure. I wish if someone's going to pick up a case, if a reporter's going to pick up a case at the beginning, I think the responsible thing to do would be to follow through on covering the case to see what actually happens.
I feel like there's sort of two threads to this story that I'm sort of grappling with. And the one is that, in a way the system really worked here. You were able to defend Maurice. The prosecutor was reasonable and dropped the charges when that seemed appropriate to him. And that's good. And then he got released. And then on the other hand, it's like a young man lost like 4 years of his life being imprisoned. And it's like, that's a horrible thing. Like what's your sort of takeaway from this experience? Like, what do you think listeners should take away from this story?
Well, I think maybe the most important thing is that, two things I would say. One, people do get charged with crimes that they didn't commit. It happens. And I think it happens more often than people would like to admit. Two, Maurice's case is the exception, the absolute exception. You could probably count on one hand the number of murder cases that have been dismissed over the last, however, many years, last few years. It just doesn't happen. The mindset is more so, let's just go to trial and we'll see what happens, rather than, let's really dig into this and see if there's problems with the case, and if there are, maybe we'll be open to getting rid of it. I think there just happen to be some really compelling aspects of this case that kind of forced a certain decision, but it does not happen frequently. So I think it's important to understand that this is the exception, not the rule. But I don't want to say it shouldn't be the exception, because you would hope that most people who are charged with crimes are, they're not being wrongfully accused. But I think one of the important lessons from this case is that you do have to have a critical eye, whether you're on the defense or you're a prosecutor, because when you're passing judgment on somebody on such an important issue, in my view, there needs to be a certain level of certainty involved. And Maurice's case isn't the only one I've seen where you really wonder if they got the right person. So, I wish a critical eye was being put to more cases.
Is it also frustrating in this case that the real perpetrator or perpetrators remain free?
From a personal standpoint, that's, from a professional standpoint, that's really, like I said, that was never my job. My job isn't to prove who committed this crime. From a personal standpoint, I feel for the families of the victims. I don't know that they'll ever get closure, because I don't think anybody will ever be charged with this crime. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think at this point it's going to become an impossibility to prove that somebody else did it. I think it's almost an impossibility to bring this case to trial at this point, given that somebody else was charged, all the witness statements out there and things like that. So I feel for the families of the victims that they may not get all the closure that they hope or wish they would get. And, I'm sorry about that for them. I'm sorry that they had to go through any of this stuff. But yeah, I think, my view is whoever did this is still out there. And I don't think that's good for anybody.
Before we ended our conversation with Barney, we wanted to ask how Maurice is doing today.
What I would say is I've always, as long as I've known Maurice, and it's been over 4 years now, I guess it's been 5 years now. Maurice is a resilient kid, very resilient kid. So, if you talk to him, you wouldn't maybe even really know he went through some of this stuff. He's got a very likable personality. He's easy to connect with. He's kind of a fun-loving guy. So how did it affect him? I can tell you without getting into the contents of the conversation, I can tell you that this stuff affected him, things that he thought about and things that nobody wants to live with. But he never let that show really on the outside. He was always a very easy person to get along with and very easy to deal with, very easy to connect with on a personal level. But I know that these events have, they've left some scars on him for sure.
We had asked to talk to Maurice for our show, but he declined through Barney. Given what he's been through over the past few years, we can certainly understand that.
In a moment, we will do something a bit unusual for us and talk, unscripted, about what we think about this case and what it means. Let's take a quick break from the Murder Sheet to tell you about a podcast investigating yet another unforgettable crime. The Orange Tree is a 7-part series about a 2005 homicide that happened near the University of Texas at Austin. The murder of 21-year-old Jennifer Cave, who was shot, dismembered, and left in a bathtub at her friend Colton Petoniak's apartment, continues to haunt the area to this day.
Like the Burger Chef murders, this case features plenty of twists and turns, including Colton's flight to Mexico with another UT student, Laura Hall. Both were later convicted in connection with the crime, although Colton has continued to appeal his verdict and claim innocence. The business student turned convicted murderer now says that he doesn't even remember much about the night Jennifer died.
The Orange Tree is reported on and produced by Haley Butler and Tanu Thomas, who were both seniors at the University of Texas when they started this project. To Together, Haley and Tanu strive to piece together this tragic story in an in-depth podcast that features audio from courtroom scenes and interrogation rooms, prison phone calls, and exclusive interviews with both the perpetrators and the victim's family. You can binge all 7 episodes of The Orange Tree today on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the murder sheet.
So what do you think that the case of Maurice Harris and the murders at Nadia Chicken says about our justice system?
I think that this case, the first thing that comes to my mind is how many Maurice Harrises are out there currently in Chicago and outside of Chicago who are languishing in prison for a crime that they did not commit, who do not have a lawyer like Ian Barney and the legal representation and the team that Maurice had behind him to defend him from these charges. I think, in recent years, there's been more of a focus on potentially wrongfully convicted people. And you and I have discussed some of them where we actually think some of the high profile ones are likely guilty and that people are jumping on sort of a bandwagon. But for all the cases that you do hear about, there's probably many cases you don't hear about that there's been a miscarriage of justice. A young person, an old person is stuck in jail because, they were wrongfully convicted. And it's a sad thing to think about, I think, for all the people who didn't have the resources that Maurice Harris had. And, I think it also says something pretty bad about bias on a number of levels.
How so?
In our criminal justice system. Well, we talked about, in Maurice's case, he is a young African-American man. I think that obviously needs to be taken into consideration here when we ask why were police so quick to signal that he was likely the murderer to the press and had that whole ridiculous press conference where they talked about his criminal juvenile record and did all sorts of bizarre and unprecedented things. Can
we talk about the police for a minute? What do you think about the bike team that was operating in the South Shore area of Chicago? That was the group of officers who were basically going around harassing men and women of color for no good reason.
And children of color as well. And that just shows a level of out of controlness that just seems kind of astounding. But then again, it was happening, and it certainly does not speak well for the Chicago Police Department, frankly, that members of their own ranks were behaving in this way and basically acting without any sort of oversight. I mean, the whole thing about that was when it eventually came out that these bike patrol officers were harassing people. Suddenly, nobody knew who their commanding officer was. So it was not like this was a situation where there was a rogue captain. It's just nobody was willing to even claim these officers as their own. And if nobody's willing to be in an oversight position, then how can you have any sort of accountability when something goes wrong? I mean, it's completely ludicrous that this was happening in 2017, or no, I guess maybe it would be a little bit earlier, like the 2000s. I mean, we're in the 21st century and this is happening. Basically, you have these cops acting almost as if they're like medieval knights who work for a local warlord and are going around rampaging and doing things without any sort of accountability, any sort of reckoning.
And even now, in hindsight, there hasn't been any real accountability for it. I don't think the department in Chicago has really come to terms with what these men did. And certainly the department has never been held to account for it. They wouldn't even talk to us on the show about it.
Yeah, I think it's one thing. I think, frankly, I don't think they've been held to account by the media. I think when you have a police department that's so obviously out of control to this extent, where you have 2 cops basically getting away with beating the crap out of a tiny teenage boy in a store over nothing. Where's the outrage? There is outrage in the community, but why is it not being translated into the mainstream media?
Why do you think the mainstream media in Chicago has not played up this story as much as you think they should?
I have no idea. Do you have any thoughts on that?
We talked once about the possibility of beat capture. Can you talk about what that is?
Okay, yeah. As a journalist, beat capture is something you hear about. Beat capture in journalism basically refers to when you cover a beat, you get to know people on that beat. So let's say, take me, for example, I'm a retail reporter by day. And that means I write about different big box stores. Maybe I get to know the folks at Target, for example. And I become friends with their PR people, and I think they're nice people. And then it comes time for me to write something that might make Target look a bit bad. Maybe I don't do it because maybe I kind of don't want to piss off my friends. That is beat capture in a nutshell. I mean, I'm kind of simplifying it, but that's pretty much it. And that can happen on any beat, but I think something that the media writ large has come to reckon with recently, as since the George Floyd murder, and even previous reckonings on race like Ferguson, there's a lot of beat capture that goes on the police beat, unfortunately. Policemen can be, police officers rather, can be great sources for somebody who's covering crime. But if it becomes too much like you're the stenographer of the police department, then you're not getting the whole story. You're just getting the police perspective on things. So to have beat capture in that area is intensely problematic when we start to realize that police institutions are by no means perfect, and when they F up, need to be held to account, and perhaps there even need to be conversations about policing communities differently, and maybe defunding the police and putting some more money into other services instead of the militarization of the police. So and if you're writing about your community and writing about crime in your community, beat capture is not great. I'm not accusing anybody in Chicago of that. I'm not saying that that's what happened here. I'm just speculating. I just don't understand why this wasn't covered. I think the other story is that a lot of regional and local news outlets are really hurting for staff. And when you have an understaffed news publication, some things are going to get left behind because the reporters are just stretched thin. They're trying to do a lot. They're trying to cover as much as they can. They're not making a lot of money. They're stressed out about their jobs. And I think we can all understand in a situation like that, that would be bad for local coverage because important stories like this might get left behind.
Yeah, and I think they get most of their stories literally directly from the police. The police hand out press releases. The police say, come to this press conference. We'll give you a really big story. And the police aren't going to give out a press release saying, we really messed up. They're going to give out stories that make them look good. In this case, they certainly gave out press releases and had this massive press conference announcing Maurice Harris's guilt. When Maurice Harris was exonerated, there were no such press releases, and there was almost no coverage whatsoever. We just found a little tiny story about it on an inside page of the Chicago Sun-Times.
Yeah, and I give them credit for running anything because nobody else seemed to. And again, we're not trying to come for the Chicago reporters or the Chicago media. I'm sure they do great work. I'm sure there's been a lot of coverage of different police incidents and problems and whatnot. But I think this story says something about the way that certain incidents or certain stories or certain narratives can sort of get memory hold by an entire city when they're not really covered extensively. And when there isn't a reporter there to really do the digging and say like, hey, I've put this all together. We need to talk about this.
Yeah, I think the Chicago media missed this story. I think I was frankly shocked that no one in the Chicago media seems to have pointed out that this person whom the police are saying is a quadruple murderer, saying this person had extensive ties and connections and experiences with the Chicago police. No one mentioned that, a big part of his connection with the Chicago police is that he was suing them because they had beaten him.
I mean, you can love it, you can hate it, you can disagree with it, you can agree with it, you can think that Steve Avery and Brendan Dassey are guilty as hell or innocent as angels, but I mean, the people behind that got 2 seasons out of the fact that basically this man is arrested on a rape that he definitely did not commit, exonerated by DNA, and then he gets out. He's going to potentially get a huge sum of money from the county for wrongful conviction, and then suddenly he's accused of murder again, or he's accused of a heinous crime again, gets convicted of murder. You know the rest of the story if you've seen that documentary series. And so, like, that's a big story. People have been talking about that, wrestling over that, but why not? Why are we not talking about Maurice Harris? In his case, it worked out for him better because he was not convicted a second time. I mean, he wasn't convicted of, the crime that he was accused of, murder. But the fact that this happened at all, and the fact that he basically had like years of his life taken away as a young man because on very scant evidence just seems appalling in its own way.
I mean, you could make the argument, and I think Ian Barney might make the argument, that the justice system is slow, but we should be grateful that, at least in this case, it finally got to the right result. Do you find any comfort in that?
No. I respect Ian Barney, and I respect his opinion on that. And I think, you lawyers are definitely going to feel that way about the system when, things like this happen. Well, at least it eventually worked. But I think this whole thing is a disgrace. And I don't think this would have happened if Maurice Harris was some rich white boy from the suburbs of Chicago. I don't. I mean, maybe something would have happened in regards to a wrongful accusation or whatnot, but I kind of don't feel like he would have been in jail the whole time. I don't know.
He was ultimately exonerated, of course, but he did lose years of his life, and he didn't even get to go to his own father's funeral.
Yeah, we need to. I mean, the human cost of this has a pretty incredible magnitude, because you have Maurice Harris losing years of his life, doesn't get to mourn his father by going to his funeral. Previously was brutalized by the police and then is sort of tricked by them into coming into the department to talk about his father's murder, gets arrested himself, gets jailed. But then you also have the families of the 4 men who were killed basically getting re-traumatized by the fact that the police basically all but say, we've knocked this one out of the park. We got our guy. He's in jail. We're going to convict him. It's, don't worry about it. And then that guy gets released and nobody is held accountable for this brutal mass slaying that happened in daylight in a public business, and nobody's getting punished for it. There's no answers. We don't have any answers. And that must be really, I mean, I can't imagine the pain that those family members and the people who loved those 4 men would be going through over this, because that's a nightmare. It's an unsolved case at this point.
It's awful for me to think of the poor Jackson family. They lost a relative in a murder at another chicken restaurant. And then in this particular case, a mother sees her 2 sons shot to death in front of her. And no one has been held accountable for this crime. And judging by the way the police handled it, or mishandled it, if you will, it's very likely that no one ever will be held accountable for this crime.
Tell me more about that in regards to like the technicality, or the specifics around why it would be so hard at this point, even if somebody came up in the street and said, I did the Nadia murders. Why would that be difficult to make that charge stick?
Well, in a case like this, you'd rely on eyewitness testimony pretty heavily. Unfortunately, in this case, a number of witnesses, either because they were coached by the police or from rumors they heard, these witnesses said it was definitely Maurice Harris that they saw. And then these witnesses recanted their testimony. They said, no, actually, it wasn't Maurice Harris, or I wasn't where I said I was, or whatever. And so because of this, these witnesses who have recanted or changed their stories came forward and said, oh, guess what? It was John Smith I saw who really committed those crimes. Any competent defense attorney could say, well, it's interesting you say it was John Smith. That's not what you said 6 months ago. And that could knock away those witnesses' stories.
Right. So it's really in a very unfortunate place.
And you need more than, if a person came forward and said, I did it, that doesn't really mean anything we know from our experiences studying Burger Chef and other cases, there's a lot of false confessions.
Yes.
And particularly in situations like this, somebody might say they did it just to get credibility, just to seem tough.
Right. And yeah, I mean, it's a disaster. It's really sad. It's a really sad case ultimately, because even though Maurice Harris didn't get convicted or spend decades in jail over something he didn't do, it's like you can't be too happy about the charges getting dropped because of how those four families must feel. And,
And not just those four families. Later that night, 2 other people were shot to death in a vehicle not far from Nadia. We've been told that those murders are related, and those families aren't getting justice. And let's also get back to Maurice and his family. His father was murdered on the streets of Chicago the night before. That crime has never been solved.
And I think one thing that also kind of pissed me off personally about this case, and also kind of sticks in my mind thinking about it now, and like when you talk about how, the police talk about these victims who were killed, in this sort of short time span, all these people getting shot and murdered in Chicago. And so often the refrain is, well, they had gang ties. Everyone has gang ties. And I mean, I'm not saying you should downplay organized crime when you're discussing the cases. I'm truly not saying that. But to me, a lot of this language sounded pretty coded in regards to, most of these victims were Black men. And when you're talking about gang ties, it just feels a little bit like the police basically kind of like dismissing it, or kind of like, we're not going to solve it because we're not going to be able to pick through the myriad angles of this gang war, basically. And to me, it feels like the opening of like an excuse, basically.
And also, it seemed to me that a lot of the talk about gangs, not just here, but in general, it seems to me that there's a lot of implicit vilification of a person for choosing to join a gang. And maybe even they brought this onto themselves by making that choice. And maybe that's an easy conclusion to come to if you live a very comfortable and privileged life. But let's think about these people in the South Shore of Chicago, where they are being hunted and harassed by police officers who are coming and humiliating them and beating them in front of their friends. In a situation like that, if I lived there and was facing that sort of harassment, if I had an opportunity to join a gang who would stand by me, I think I might do it.
I mean, frankly, this is a cliche at this point, but it seems like the largest, most powerful gang was sort of the authorities in that part of Chicago, at least when Maurice was growing up. And, and particularly the bike patrol, this is they're violent. They're acting with impunity. No one's accountable. They're basically going around and selecting random targets to harass. Sounds like a gang. And when you're faced with basically the authorities acting like a gang, that might spur more gang formation in the neighborhood, just for the sake of protection. If you're a 14-year-old boy dealing with that, if you're a teenage boy dealing with that, you're going to want to band together so no one fucks with you, pardon my French, but I'm not excusing gang, activity. I'm not excusing organized crime. Obviously that leads to a lot of suffering and bad things happening. But when it just feels like it's an out of control situation when you have the police also behaving much like a gang.
Comparing the police to gangs brings up a rather obvious question. One thing that gangs are rather notorious for doing is that they will go to often outrageous lengths to protect their own. In this case, Maurice Harris was suing the police department of Chicago for harassing and beating him. And he had video proof of what happened to him, and he was winning that case. And then suddenly he is arrested and charged with quadruple murder and basically convicted in a press conference in front of the whole city. Do you think there is any connection between him getting that sort of treatment and him fighting the police in court.
So I'll say to that you and I, as we investigated this, as we looked through different documents, court filings, as we talked to people, we did not find any shred of evidence to support any sort of theory that the Chicago police intentionally framed Maurice, for lack of a better term, in order to, get him convicted, get him thrown away, so the charges against them would be dropped and they wouldn't have to, shell out for a lawsuit or have some of their own guys get fired. We don't have any evidence of that. Nobody's saying that. Nobody has said that as or offered any evidence around that. But I mean, it looks pretty bad, right? I mean, whatever. I mean, listen, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I also think that if you're an institution that's sort of tasked with keeping the community and the public safe, maybe before you have a public press conference naming the guy who's suing you as your big murder suspect in a really heinous case, maybe you should make sure your case against him is like existent beyond conflicting witness statements that may or may not have been coached. I think that would be my statement on that. I'm not going to say that anything untoward happened here in that regard, but I also think, I guess it just doesn't seem very rational to go so public with a suspect like that. I mean, you'd think, let's just talk about like what would be the normal or maybe advisable thing to do in a situation like that if you were the authorities. Somebody has just heinously murdered a group of men at a restaurant. You think you might have somebody who did it, in lockup. Maybe the thing to do is to just keep working the case, keep investigating that, until trial, and then things can play out as they will in the court, right? I mean, I can understand saying we've made an arrest, but saying we got him, also he's a bad guy because he did crimes when he was younger, seems like it's an odd thing to do, given what we understand of the typical playbook that is advised in cases like this, where you don't play all your cards in a public press conference.
Of course, Ian Barney was outraged by that, and Ian Barney also told us pretty conclusively that he didn't feel there was a connection between the civil suit and what happened to Maurice in the criminal courts. I'd like to talk a little bit about Ian Barney. He is a very busy attorney, but it's obvious that this case meant a lot to him because he would always find the time to talk to us about it when we had questions. Sometimes we'd have to go weeks between our conversations with him because he was so busy. But I was really impressed with how much this case meant to him and how hard he fought for Maurice.
Ian Barney is awesome. You and I definitely enjoyed really getting to talk to him about this case in depth and getting his insights on not just the case, but sort of his approach to law. And yeah, I think he's a really impressive lawyer. I think if you were having trouble in the city of Chicago, he's definitely a good bet. He just seems to really have some really good instincts around what his clients need. But yeah, he's a very impressive guy, very smart, obviously incredibly passionate about his legal work. And I think he really does his clients some great service. And I think he definitely made an impact on him. But I think I also appreciated his like level of, rationality. He's not going around being like the Chicago police are corrupt or the whole system is corrupt. He's very much like, not playing into conspiracy theories, not playing into just whatever sounds good. He's very much after the facts. What did you think about, one thing that this kind of miniseries sort of lacked was the voice of the man at the center of it, Maurice Harris. He declined to comment. He didn't want to kind of go through it again. As somebody who represents the sister of a victim of a heinous crime, tell me how that sort of fit into your understanding of like what it means to really be in the center of one of these cases and not just have it be something that you read about or listen to or whatever, but something that you actually live through.
You never know how you're going to react to something like this until you're in the middle of it. And there's no one healthy way to respond or not to respond. We've researched and worked on murder cases where the family is very involved and very concerned and very talkative and very vocal about wanting justice. And we've also done cases where the family, in order to heal, wants to just move on and get on with their lives and not dwell on the past. Maurice seems to be someone who just wants to get on with his life. And I understand that. I think if it were me and something like this happened to me and I lost years of my life, if I thought about it too much, it might make me too angry. It might just make me furious. And maybe the healthy thing to do is just to move on and concentrate on enjoying what it's like to be free.
I think we can definitely understand that. And it's also not a victim's job, because Maurice is a victim here. He was victimized by the system. You know, whether that was intentional or not, we're not saying that. We're just saying, like, he, you know, was brutally beaten. His dad was murdered. Then he was accused of some sort of revenge murder that, you know, was so weak that the charges were ultimately dropped, but not before he spent years in prison. So, you know, I think when whether you're the family member of a murder victim, whether you're the victim of a brutal attack, whether you are somebody who was wrongfully convicted, you know, it's not your job to perform for people and like take them inside your trauma. You know, that's your private business. And I think sometimes as consumers of true crime, you can get a little bit like, well, I want to hear that person's story. And you know, it's like, it's not like, a fictional movie that you can kind of like just get into. It's something horrible that happened to somebody. And I think it bears for I think all of us should remember that sometimes, because it can be easy, understandably, to get caught up in sort of the story of things and sort of maybe forget a bit that we're really talking about the worst day of several people's lives here. How did it feel to you to visit Nadia's, which is still in business on the South Shore?
We try as often as we can to visit the locations of where these crimes happen. And it's always very helpful, because just reading about something or seeing video of it, it doesn't really give you the impression of what it's like to actually stand there in that neighborhood. I found it fascinating to be there. It wasn't quite what I expected. There was an empty lot across the street. There was a couple of nice apartments not far down the road. What did you make of the neighborhood?
Yeah, I always feel like I'm really bad at picturing a place. Like, we'll be reading about a crime and really getting into it, and I'll like have some like dumb cartoony idea of what it is, and then we get there and it's totally different. In this case, it was definitely a, you know, pretty quiet day, pretty quiet neighborhood. There were a couple of people walking about, but I was just, you know, and the thing is, right now we're in the, you know, when we visited, it was still sort of pandemic times. We were only just starting to come out of it. So that might have been part of it.
Didn't you feel a little nervous?
I felt a little nervous. I mean, I think in terms of the fact that this was the site of what seems like a random, or at least somewhat random, crime where, you know, 4 people were gunned down and we still don't understand the reason. You know, that's I think enough to make most people a little nervous when they're visiting a place. But, you know, in general, it was mostly just odd to be there, because it was just like silent. There weren't a lot of people, not a lot of cars, and you're just like thinking about like what happened in 2017 and just like how awful, the sudden sound of gunfire erupting on a street like that, how awful that must have been for everybody, in the vicinity to hear, because it's like suddenly a normal day is just thrust into like this horrible new reality that you have to deal with and like be afraid for your life. It just, it was definitely eerie. It gave me a very eerie feeling. And like the water, and the one thing I didn't picture, the water of Lake Michigan is like right nearby. Like you're like a few blocks away. And it's so blue and beautiful, and you're like in this inland ocean. And it's just like you watch that and it's very calming and like beautiful. And then you like think about what happened, and it's just I don't know, we were driving around, we were driving past that, and then we go over to Nadia, and it's just kind of like you're thrust into this like grim reality of like what happened here. It just seemed odd being so close to something so beautiful. What did you think? We kind of shot on the, we kind of criticized the Chicago media, but we have to give them credit because that's how we found this case. It's not like it wasn't covered at all. Do you want to talk a bit about the initial coverage that got us interested?
Back last summer, before this podcast was even a glimmer in our eyes, we got interested in compiling information about restaurant homicides. And the reason for that is because we were interested in the Burger Chef case. And the Burger Chef murders have some very unusual and unique features. And we got to wondering, are those features really unique or unusual? And so the only way to figure that out is let's look at a bunch of other restaurant murders. And so in the course of doing that and looking up different newspaper articles from the past, we were also looking at articles that were current. And we had different Google alerts set up to alert us of developments in restaurant murder cases. And one of these Google alerts let us know about this case in Chicago where the Sun-Times ran this little tiny article about some man named Maurice Harris getting released and charges dropped against him in the Nadia chicken case. And usually when you see something like that, you just kind of assume this person must have gotten off on a technicality. But in this case, Ian Barney, Harris's lawyer, was quoted as saying that if the standard of proof had been proving beyond a reasonable doubt that this man was innocent, we could have done it. And that really caught my eye because it was a pretty strong word.
That's basically a lawyer doing like the Babe Ruth thing where he pointed the bat to indicate he was going to get a home run.
But I saw Barney's comment and it got me curious. Does he really mean that? Is he just talking big? So we decided to talk to him and get the facts. And that's what led us to this case.
And also, we talked about what Ian Barney was like earlier, but like I was really impressed that he just sticks to the facts. It's not like a bombastic lawyer thing where it's like, well, we're going to do this or that. It's like, no. Like, he knows what he's talking about. I think that's very impressive. Because anybody could say, I'm going to prove my client innocent. But it's another thing to really try to, back that up. I wanted to ask you, because maybe this is, with us, how we tend to read or view cases. You're a lawyer, I'm a journalist. I think I'm speaking generally here. This is not always the case, but I think generally I tend to be more sucked into like the more like, oh, this is a conspiracy. It's more complicated than it looks. And you tend to be more like that's my bias, which I try to fight against, obviously, and just go with the facts. But I think your bias tends to be, the prosecution, if they charge the person and like won the conviction, the person's probably guilty. Like it's hard to do a wrongful conviction almost in many cases. Is that fair? And like, has this case changed your thinking about that at all?
Yeah, in my thinking, most cases of so-called wrongful convictions are just not wrongful at all. We're just seeing very zealous defense attorneys with good press strategies fooling people. And the press, again, because we talked earlier about the press just basically often printing press releases, the press will print press releases from defense attorneys or have uncritical interviews with defense attorneys who are promoting the idea of a wrongful conviction, and they don't challenge those narratives. And people get the wrong idea that wrongful convictions are much more prevalent than they are.
I think that's absolutely, and I'm a journalist and I can say that absolutely happens. And it can happen with anything from a wrongful conviction to a new business strategy to, conspiracy theories about autism being caused by vaccines. It's an unfortunate reality.
I think wrongful convictions do happen. I think that the fact that they are covered so uncritically means that a lot of them that do get covered and get attention aren't really wrongful convictions. And so that makes it harder to find the true cases of actual wrongful convictions. So this hasn't changed my thinking. I recognize the justice system is imperfect, but things like this happen. And I I'm glad the system worked in the end.
Yeah.
I guess generally speaking, my bias is you can explain something. The most likely explanation for any event is the dullest, least interesting explanation that fits all the facts, which often is the prosecution's theory.
Such a prosecutor. Yeah, I tend to think, I don't know. I think I always like to get, one thing that was frustrating to cover regarding covering this case is, as a journalist, I like to get all sides of the story. I really like to get everyone in there. That's not to say that I want to uncritically both sides of story and say like, these two things are equal. But I like it when at least you can get both sides on the record to say, okay, here's my take on it. Here's my take on it. And then you can kind of weigh both of that in your coverage and at least present both sides, even if you're maybe saying like, this was a bad thing, no matter what, that this happened to this young man. But I was disappointed that the Chicago police couldn't even spare like enough time to like give a statement to us or something. And we made them aware about what we were going to cover. It wasn't like, hey, just give us a quote on this. It was like very much like, we're going to talk about this and that and this. And they didn't give anything. And it just felt like, if you want to be a institution that leans into accountability and leans into learning from mistakes and takes its role in the community seriously, I think you should give a statement. I think you should send somebody to talk about it, not to spin, but to give insight. So that was definitely disappointing. Maybe not surprising, but when you are the institution in society that is licensed to kill, basically the instrument that can dole out violence in order to further what the state wants, you need to be accountable to the people. This is not a police state. You don't get to do whatever the hell you want. But I think some would prefer it to be more a police state where people go away and they don't question what you did. And, you can send a bunch of bike cops around to harass teens in the neighborhood and nobody says anything about it. How does this case make you feel?
I have a lot of faith in the justice system. I'm glad it worked out in the end, that an innocent person was not incarcerated. But it leaves me shaken that innocent man lost years of his life. And it leaves me very badly shaken that the person or persons who took the lives of 6 young people in Chicago would never face justice for what they did and for what they took away from the people who loved those victims.
It's bad all around, even though there was a good outcome in Maurice's case.
Before we go, I thought maybe we could say just a few words about some of the things we have coming up. We often ask at the end of the shows if you have any ideas for cases you'd like us to cover, to please write and let us know. And in the next few weeks, we're actually going to cover a case that was suggested by a listener. Also, we have 2 more mini-series coming up. One of them is going to actually break our format a little bit and not deal with restaurants. It is a possible serial killer case that Áine has a special connection to. And the other one we're going to do is we're going to return to Burger Chef and go a little bit more in-depth and maybe cover a few things that are a bit more controversial than what we covered last year.
Yeah, we're going to get into it, guys. Get ready. It's gonna be interesting. Well, I'll be curious what you guys think of this revisit to You Never Can Forget, our mini series on the Burger Chef murders.
So if any of you have any questions that you'd like us to cover in the Burger Chef episodes we're now preparing, please get them to us right away.
Yeah, we'll try to address your questions at least, if not in an episode, then in an email.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murdersheet, and on Facebook at msheetpodcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.